Looks like the numbers are leveling off, so we'll go ahead and get started slowly. Welcome everybody this evening. Thank you so much for joining us in this exploration and celebration of the pink wave, this flamingo invasion that we are all excitedly watching right now. I'm Julie Raithmel, Executive Director of Audubon Florida, which is the Florida State Program of the National Audubon Society. Our staff are about 100 scientists, resource managers, researchers, educators, policy wonks, and I'm really excited to be able to share with you one of our most knowledgeable, Dr. Jerry Lorenz. So Dr. Lorenz is our Director of Research for Florida, and in that capacity, he's spent more than 34 years performing applied ecological studies in Florida Bay and the Everglades. His primary research focus has been on the effect of water management practices on Florida Bay by examining food web dynamics of roseate spoonbills. And his results have been used to design structural and operational changes that benefit ailing Florida Bay and are used to guide future restoration efforts as part of the $10 billion Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. Now, those are high stakes and high dollar projects, but at his core, like Audubon, Jerry is for the birds. In addition to his incomparable expertise on Florida's other pink bird, roseate spoonbills, Jerry is a founding member of the Florida Flamingo Working Group. I can think of no better person at this special moment in time to share their insights on the current flamingo invasion, Audubon's history with flamingos in Florida, and what their future may hold. So thank you, Jerry, for joining us today and sharing your flamingo expertise with us tonight.
Thank you, Julie. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's my pleasure to be here. And so this is been a monumental couple of weeks as far as I'm concerned with this invasion of flamingos. That's just unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this before. Trying to move my screen. Right off the bat, there it is. So Hurricane Idalia came through, basically, if you followed it from the Yucatan, it came up and cut through the panhandle and then the southern states and kind of exited out of North Carolina. And along with this storm, with the devastation, we never welcome hurricanes here in Florida, but we did welcome some passengers. And this is what we started seeing, is these amazing reports from all over the state of Florida and outside the state of Florida, flamingos just showing up. And it started right after the storm, and it was just rather amazing to start seeing this, because about 8 or 9 years ago, we started tracking these birds. It was longer than that. Peter Frezza, my former employee, started this about 15 years ago, and then I picked it up after he left. And we would get, a couple of, maybe 6 or 7 sightings a year. And we had literally hundreds of sightings in just a couple of days from all over the state of Florida and all over the Southeast. In this slide where you see the flamingos, these are places not only in the Southeast, but Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky. I grew up here just in Cincinnati. And I didn't see any flamingos when I was growing up as a kid. I know that, except at the zoo. But in almost all the southern states, we had flamingos being sighted. But most of them, in Texas as well, most of them were in Florida. And so questions immediately started to come up. I've been answering questions pretty much continuously during that period, myself and all my colleagues. Questions like, where did they come from? Why are they so spread out? What will they eat? Will they stay? And one of the more important ones is, why aren't there more flamingos in Florida? And I'm glad you asked, because this is what we've been trying to figure out. So about almost 10 years ago now, I was approached by colleagues at Zoo Miami, and they wanted to start talking about flamingos. And at that point in time, I was under the impression, because it was part of the scientific lexicon, and I'll explain that in a minute, that these birds were escapees from captive populations. Stephen Whitfield, who was kind of our leader, pretty much disabused me of that idea fairly quickly. And we started to delve into the history of flamingos in Florida. Now, you would think with all the iconic messaging that Florida uses with flamingos, that, they'd be everywhere, postcards, posters. The biggest one, of course, is the Florida lottery. It's everywhere. But just all these postcards from Miami Beach. But there just weren't that many, there are no wild flamingos in Florida. That was the assumption that I had. And then there were these guys, right? Let's see if I can get this to work. So everybody associates flamingos with particularly Miami. And those birds were actually a captive population at the Hialeah racetrack. Whoops. So what started all this was in 2015, there were 3 flamingos that were found on Boca Chica Key on the Naval Air Station there. The commander of that base doesn't like big pink birds flying around his billion-dollar aircraft. So he could have eliminated them, but instead he got in touch with Zoo Miami and said, if you want to get these birds off of here, please come and get them, but they can't be on my airfield. It's a danger to my pilots and my planes. So my colleagues at the zoo decided to go and try and trap these birds. Well, they were successful in capturing one, named him Conkey. He was not in good shape at the time. He had some, I believe, liver flukes. There was some dietary issues. So they took him back to the zoo and rehabbed him, got him healthy, and then they were going to release him back into the wild with a satellite tracker on it to kind of figure out where these birds were going or coming from. And unfortunately, the state of Florida said, you can't release that bird. And the reason is that the state of Florida considered them non-natives. The first years that they were here was 1930s, which is about when Hialeah Racetrack was formed. And although they recognized that they were vagrants, they really felt that these were escapees. And it was my 2 predecessors, the directors of research at the Everglades Science Center, then the Tavernier Science Center, that established that these birds were probably escapees. But at the time, the zoo approached myself and my colleagues and said, can you help us get permission from the state to release these birds? Well, we were armed with this. So we had at that time 2 birds that had been banded that we could track to being chicks from the Yucatan. So we could tell the state that not all flamingos in Florida were non-native, that they were birds that were coming from at least the Yucatan, probably also from Cuba. A 3rd bird was found in 2020 after we published this, but this is what the state agreed to. This is why they agreed to let us release Conkey. But it also started the question of, well, what is native and what isn't? And we wanted to delve into the history of flamingos in Florida. So we went back, and we couldn't have done this in even the 2000s. We could do library researches, we could do online searches, we could do museum searches right from our computer. And so that's what we did. And what we found are all these publications in ornithological journals from the 1800s. And yeah, this is a busy table here, but it just lists the years that the reports came from, who reported them and when. But this is the most important thing here, is the numbers. Large flock, a great number, greater than 500, tens of thousands. 2 large flocks, greater than 2,500, 1,000, 1,500 to 1,000. You'll also notice that only one of these is from outside of South Florida. This is one from Tampa Bay. All the other ones are Florida Keys or Everglades, Florida Bay. So the native habitat could be realistically be all of Florida, but the concentration of our population was the Everglades in Florida Bay. We also found 19 specimens from museums from 1857 and 1918. And then magically, no additional museum specimens after 1918 until 1948, and only 5 since. In addition to the 19 specimens, there were 3 of these were females with ovaries that were within 3 to 5 weeks of laying, suggesting that they were actually nesting in Florida. We also found 4 flamingo eggs labeled as collected in Florida from museum specimens. And we had one credible but controversial account of nests observed in the Lower Keys in 1903. And so all of these things lead to the conclusion that yes, flamingos are part of Florida's native avifauna. What happened to them was the plume trade. Became fashionable in around the 1880s for women to start wearing feathers on their hats. And the more elaborate, the better as time went on. And it became fashionable to actually wear a bird like this middle one here, a whole bird skin on your hat. And this drove up the price of feathers. It created the millinery trade. And these feathers were worth more than their weight in gold, literally. Then, and of course, if you can go into a wading bird colony, all these birds nest in groups that we call colonies. And so there'll be 100 to 10,000 birds in one spot. You could make a whole lot of money by going in there with a small caliber weapon and just shooting the parents right off the nest. And that's what happened is, you know, you walk in with some bullets, you walk out with a pocket full of gold, literally. And so all of our wading birds were pretty well extirpated from the state of Florida and throughout their range, and flamingos were no exception. And so the population was really decimated by the time laws were put into place in the early 1900s to stop this literal massacre of our birds. And so we then looked at the data since then, and you'll notice this is from 1905 to 1939, and we have 1, 1, 3, 1, 14. And coincidentally, this is the same year that some birds were released at Hialeah Park, and they flew away. And then not again, and for the rest of the account, it was less than 4. You're not seeing the thousands, you're just seeing 1s and 2s. And then after the 1938 account, we really don't see flamingos again until about the 1960s. So our conclusions from our history lesson is that flamingos naturally occurred in large numbers in Florida prior to 1900. They may have nested. They were largely hunted to extirpation in Florida by 1905, and hunting throughout their range, again, for the plume trade, resulted in approximately 80% decline in numbers, and I believe it was actually much, much higher than that, and restricted their range to just a few nesting places. They were nesting throughout the Caribbean. By the time this onslaught ended, they were nesting in, I believe, 6 places, 8 places, something like that, and that's all there were. So enter this gentleman. This is Robert Porter Allen, who established the office that I work out of, the Everglades Science Center. At that time it was called the Tavernier Science Center. And Bob was a special person. He was brilliant. I had the pleasure of making friends with Bob over the years by sitting in the same chair that he sat in and reading his notes and his letters. He was just an amazing person. But one of the things Bob did, excuse me, I have been talking a whole lot the last 2 weeks, mostly to reporters. And so I'm having a little trouble, but I'm working through it. But Bob published these what we call treaties on on 3 birds, the whooping crane, the roseate spoonbill, and the other bird that I have focused on, and the flamingos. And he also wrote 2 popular books, The Flame Birds, which is about all about flamingos, or I'm sorry, spoonbills, and then On the Trail of Vanishing Birds, which is mostly about the other 2 species. Bob was the person who really started talking about flamingos in Florida and that they were probably escapees. And at the time, he was probably right. He estimated that a minimum of 95,000 flamingos nested in 28 population units prior to the plume hunting era. That's probably 10 times that amount. It really, Bob used specific numbers. He did not have the internet. He did not have satellite trackers. So I think that's a gross underestimate of the number of flamingos that were out there. By 1952, now these are good estimates, he estimated that there were only 21,500 nesting pairs of flamingos left. And that's because there were only these couple of places that the birds were nesting, and he could physically go count them. And so that's devastating to go from what I think is about 1 million nesting pairs to 21,000. Their range just collapsed. There were no longer any flamingos flying from far away in the Bahamas to Florida because there just weren't that many more of them. He did specify 4 locations. So then why are they considered non-native? That the reason why is because of these guys. I showed you that film clip earlier. Flamingos were introduced to many kind of roadside attractions in Florida. Bok Tower Gardens was one. There were like 10 different attractions that imported flamingos to Florida. And Hialeah Racetrack imported, I think, like 50. And I don't know that number specifically in 1931. And they didn't clip their wings, and the birds just flew away. So they tried again a couple years later, and they did clip their wings. And the end result was they established this nesting population at Hialeah Racetrack. And now those birds are free flying. After a couple of years, they stopped clipping their wings. The birds would come back, and absolutely they would nest and make more, and then they would continue on. And so there they really were probably the source of those birds in the 30s and 40s, where we see 1s and 2s. And Bob latched onto that and said that he felt that all of those birds that were being seen were escapees from these attractions. So the absence of observations from the 30s and 40s, the coincidence of them reappearing at the same time as Hialeah Racetrack and 13 other places, the low numbers of remaining flamingos in Cuba, the long distance to the Yucatan. This put non-native status in the scientific lexicon, and it did not go away. And that's what I was taught. When I came on board in 1989, Sandy Sprunt, who worked with Bob Allen, who took over from Bob Allen, who studied flamingos in the Bahamas, said, those are all escapees. So right now, BirdLife International estimates 260,000 individuals. I think that's again a gross underestimation. We estimated that there are 157,000 individuals in Cuba in 2004, 6 major wetland nesting sites. Rio Maximo in Mexico had between 22,000 and 51,000 nests. So that's nesting pairs from 1998 to 2008. The population, once it was protected, exploded back and started reclaiming its range. So we went into the literature and we looked at things like Audubon Field Notes, American Birds, Florida Naturalist, and they all report on these occasional rare birds. And we started to put all of that information together. We looked at Audubon's Christmas bird count, which followed those things. And ultimately, we went to modern technology. So we could go online to eBird, which is an online portal where you can report bird sightings. EdMaps is another one. My colleague Pete Frezza, who worked for me for 18 years, he began documenting flamingo sightings in Florida in 2000 because he felt it was important to do so at that time. I didn't even know he was doing this, but I'm thankful that he was. And since Pete has left Audubon, I have taken up where he left off, and now I do this. But here's just a picture of where flamingos have been recited. This is just a snapshot. And so it's all over the state of Florida. So our data search resulted in 495 observations of 3,100 flamingos. 60% of the observation and 70% of the flamingos were again observed in Florida Bay and the Keys. That's the epicenter of their population. 26% of the observation and the flamingos themselves were in the Everglades regions, Biscayne Bay, Gulf Coast, Everglades. And so almost all of these birds were in South Florida. And flamingos were observed in every month in Florida Bay, so they were year round. We analyzed this statistically using general linear models. And here's the results. And this is just the number of birds seen every year from 1915 to 2010. And you can see this steady increase. We also looked at this, and this is total number of observations made per year. And I got to tell you this, right now, this is way off the charts. Over the last 3 weeks, I would have to redraw this graph for what's happened over the last 2 weeks. But both of these things, though, you can explain by saying, well, there's more people, right? There weren't as many people in the 40s, and then 50s grew, 60s just grew. So, of course, with more people, you're going to have more resightings of flamingos, and you're going to see more of them. But this one I find very convincing. This is the flock size. So if it's just more people, your odds of seeing one bird versus 140 are going to be the same. And so the flock size is kind of independent of how many people are making the observation. And again, it's this steady increase. And since 2000, we have had fairly large flocks, including one of more than 140 birds. I believe that was in 2011. And I got to tell you, we talked to Hialeah Racetrack. They said if 140 of our birds were missing, we would notice. So it's unlikely that those birds were escapees. So what this resulted in is our publication. And the day of our publication, and we were communicating with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission people, and we let them know, we gave them advance copies, we let them know this paper was coming out and they should be aware of it. The day it came out, they removed non-native status from their website. And this is what you typed in, you would get a page not found. And since then, they certainly have recognized that in Florida, that flamingos are a native species, deserve the same protections as every other birds. So science informs policy. Let's get back to Conkey. That's where this story started. So let's finish up. Conkey was released just outside of Everglades National Park in Florida Bay on December 3rd, 2015. This is my colleague, Dr. Frank Ridgely. Frank and I worked very closely together last week on some things that I'll explain in a minute. But Conkey was released into Florida Bay, and this is just the satellite hits that we had. And so we have these core areas where, this is where 95% of the sightings are. This is where 50% of the sightings are. And you can see it's basically 4 locations in Florida Bay, Club Key, State Key, Captain's Key, and then Snakebite, which is this wide open area. So while it was at these locations, you can see it is inside mostly of these keys where we have these interior ponds, and nobody could see the bird. Frank actually called me one day and said, can you please go out to State Key and make sure that bird is there? Because nobody was seeing them. And sure enough, Pete and I went out, and we walked on there, and there's this nice big flamingo just hanging out. Nobody could see it. But then when it moved to snakebite, this is an open area that's heavily fished. There's this channel that runs through it. And all of a sudden people started seeing it. So Conkey used the habitats where detection probability was low by humans. There were only 15 times that it was sighted on eBird, and 13 of those were from snakebite. This bird was out there 661 days, almost 2 years, and it was only recited twice. So these birds can be very secretive. You would think a giant pink bird, everybody would notice it, but no, I mean, we had a reciting of 50 birds just last year. I went out the day after I was told about it in a boat. A colleague from Everglades National Park went out in a plane, and then another colleague went out the next day after that in a helicopter. We could not find those 60 birds. So, they're not just as conspicuous as you think they are, and the Everglades is a big place. So what happened with Conkey was that after 661 days, about 2 days after Hurricane Wilma hit, the transmitter stopped. And we don't think it was mortality. We got this picture shortly thereafter, and you can kind of see this blue on the leg. This is way far away in snakebite. But what we did learn from Conkey is that habitats within Florida Bay can support flamingos for multiple years. Bird was out there at least 2 years, probably longer. Conkey may have left after Hurricane Irma because guess what? Flamingos showed up during that storm as well. And Conkey may have just latched on with them and flew back to wherever he came from. It's a possible photograph from that period. But habitat use made detection probability to humans surprisingly low. And so there may be birds here already and they may be nesting. We just don't know exactly where to look. So let me introduce you to Pinky. Pinky, there's a photograph by Karen Wells. Karen and I have been talking quite a bit over the last 2 weeks. She pointed out that she knows Pinky very well and that got a very distinctive little mark right there on his bill. But this bird has been consistently recited at St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge for 5 years. So Florida can sustain flamingos, and flamingos are coming back to Florida. Whether we will have a permanent population or not remains the question, and we're hoping that perhaps this pink wave will be the establishment of that population. So our conclusions are that between about 1880 and 1905, flamingos were basically extirpated. Range-wide, they lost 80% of the population. Currently, flamingos are doing very well. They appear to have rebounded, possibly to the level that they were prior to this extinction event. American flamingos were natural members of Florida avifauna. They're supposed to be here. Their historic range in Florida may have been statewide, but primarily, again, Florida Keys, Florida Bay, Everglades. And Everglades restoration efforts may have enticed them to come back. By fixing the Everglades, we may have repaired Florida Bay to the point where now it can sustain populations. Maybe it couldn't have in the 50s and 60s. I know it was not in good shape in the 80s when I arrived here with seagrass die-off and algal blooms and that sort of thing. So current Everglades habitats that were historically flamingo population centers are currently capable of supporting these, and I believe that to be because we have been trying to restore them. So what are my next steps? This is that original slide I showed you with birds all over the state of Florida. We are going to mine this data. Examples, eBird. We will go to eBird. Everybody's reporting these. 66 reports on August 30th alone. One day, and it was right after they started being reported. More than 250 individual birds have been reported on Facebook. That's by my account. That's just me, right? That is not mining. That's not going after it. I've also received more than 50 emails of photos and pictures and videos of spoonbills from all over the state and even outside the state. And then there are other social media outlets we can tap into. And our goal will be to be able to tell you. At this point in time, I can't tell you how many birds there are. There's too many reports coming in, too many duplicates. This set of 8 birds seen here and then 10 miles away, seen again. Is that the same set of 8 birds? My colleagues and I are going to start digesting that. We have a meeting tomorrow to start going over this so that we can actually get data, and hopefully we will be publishing this. 2 things is I showed you those 3 birds that were from the Yucatan. Here's 2 more. This is just in the last couple of weeks. We had a band DXCL on Grassy Key, just outside of Marathon, just south of where I'm sitting right now on September 5th. That bird is 23 years old. And then my good friend, Garo Harold, took this picture just 2 days ago. It's Snakebite, where Conkey was hanging out. And that bird is FXCH. He was banded in 2005, so he's 18 years old. Both of these birds were banded at the Rio Lagartos Biosphere Reserve in the Yucatan. So this is why I think all these birds have come from the Yucatan. Could have come from Cuba, could have come from the Bahamas. You know, I ask them, they don't tell me except this way. So now I want you to meet Peaches. Peaches was rescued from, I believe, the Gulf. It might have been the inside waterway just off St. Pete Beach. He was swimming in the water, was in obvious distress. A fishing guide kindly fished him out with a fish net. He was not moving around so well. I don't know if it's a he or she at this point. We will find that out. We do have feather samples. And they took him to Seaside Seabird Sanctuary. I found out about this, contacted them. Wonderful people who allowed me to, I asked them if I could come and band Pinky, and to put a tracking device on it. But I didn't have the permits. I wasn't allowed federally to go do that. So I contacted my colleagues at the USGS bird banding lab, and I sent them an email. I said, is there any way you can do this? And it usually takes, a couple of weeks. They say 30 to 60 days, but it usually takes them a couple of weeks for them to go through all their paperwork and say, yes, Dr. Lorenz, you are qualified to do this. They turned it around in about 18 hours. And gave me permission to do this. I worked with Zoo Miami's Frank Ridgely. He actually had, it was kind of like I had the skates, you have the skate key. He had the bands and the satellite tracker. I had the permission to band it. So we worked together. We went to the Seaside Seabird Sanctuary, and we put satellite transmitter in this blue band, which says USO2. Conkey was USO1. We have these up to USO9. We hope to put them out, but it was 8 years in between 1 and 2. So I'm not going to hold my breath, but I do have permission now from the bird banding lab to band any flamingos that come to a rehab center in the state of Florida. And then let's get back to Pinky. Pinky's been hanging out all by himself for 5 years. And this is a picture again that Karen sent me where he's got, some buddies with him. We don't know whether they're stay or whether he'll go with them. I'm not sure at this point. He has been photographed alone. Karen has photographed him a couple times over the last few days where he's not with other birds, but we'll see. So with that, I want to thank all of my colleagues. These are organizations who support our research at the Everglades Science Center. And we want to thank them all for supporting our program. And with that, I'm going to take a break and hand it back to Julie.
Thank you, Jerry. You definitely are the resident and reigning flamingo expert. So thank you so much for sharing this with us tonight. I will just point out that as expert and knowledgeable as Jerry is, flamingos are only one small part of the work that he and his team do at Everglades Science Center. Yet by protecting and restoring the Everglades, like he said, we're also protecting flamingos. If we aspire to a day in the future when flamingos might breed successfully in Florida again, they have to have a place where they can do that safely and successfully. And that's what the science that Jerry and his researchers are contributing to making possible. His team, his scientists are on the water 5 days a week at a minimum, as he mentioned, studying birds, fish, water quality, and more. And that is all done through our nonprofit status. So the funding that makes that possible comes from individuals just like you. To support our groundbreaking research, we have to have the gear, vehicles, and staff to do it both thoroughly and safely. Next slide, please. But there's ways that you can help. I don't know if you're like me, but I'm very excited by the idea of perhaps one day having flamingos back in Florida year round, something that my kids can enjoy that I didn't get to enjoy as a child myself. But that's not going to happen without all of our help. So ways that you can get involved is help us to advocate for Everglades restoration and clean water. And how do you go about doing that? Well, Audubon members, when we were just founded, passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to protect flamingos and other wading bird species from the plume trade that Jerry told you decimated them. Today, this means advocating for things like the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan and making sure that we're protecting water quantity, quality, and timing. You can find out about opportunities to lend your voice to the Everglades, water quality, and the birds by joining our flock. You can sign up for our advocate newsletter to learn when to use your voice for wildlife. We'll also be sending out updates as we receive them about flamingos there as well. So that's a great way to keep in touch and to stay connected with this exciting, evolving flamingo story. Next slide. And we especially need your help if you're so moved to support the work directly that Jerry and his team do. Whether it's a small gift or large, every gift matters, and they add up to big impacts for the Everglades, for flamingos, and for all of the birds and other wildlife that call those places home. Audubon is proud to have been working on conservation in Florida since 1900, since 1930 in Florida Bay. And it's this long history and our devotion to science that makes us a singular voice for these places and the birds. So if you have the ability to support Jerry's work, we'd be grateful for your help in helping to support the return of flamingos and the continuation of other species in the Everglades in South Florida. Next slide. So with that, I'm sure that there have been lots of questions streaming into chat. I know that I have seen several as we've gone through. I'm going to turn it over to communications maven Erica Zambello, who will moderate those questions. And thank you, Jerry, in advance for helping everybody scratch the pink itch and learn the latest about this exciting development for Florida and the whole Eastern United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Jerry. So 3 questions have already sort of flown to the forefront. And the first one is, how again did flamingos end up all the way in Ohio and Pennsylvania? Can you talk about how the storm deposited these birds?
Well, I have 3 ideas, and one of them is simply that these birds were flying either to or from the Yucatan from Cuba. And as that storm, it was a tropical depression, and I think a day later, maybe 2 days later, it was a tropical storm. A day after that, it was a hurricane. Day after that, it was a Category 3 hurricane, and it was rushing towards Florida. It was moving at a very high rate of speed forward, more than 20 knots, I believe. And I think what happened is these birds were making that crossing. The storm kept getting worse and kept getting bigger. They kept trying to fly around it. and they couldn't. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And as that storm moved northward, it was carried with them. And if you look at the path of the storm, it cuts across, the Florida Panhandle into Georgia, North Carolina, or South Carolina, and then exited in North Carolina. Well, as that storm was losing power, I think those birds kind of fell out of the storm to either side. They were probably exhausted, traumatized. And so most of them dropped off to the south, which is, would be the intense side of the storm. But some of them would have been on the less violent side of the storm. And those birds would have fallen out kind of on that path, towards Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Pennsylvania, as it exited. So they didn't want to be anywhere near that eye. Now, another theory is that, as I said, they're coming back. And it's possible that the birds kind of rode the wave along with they wanted to come here. But storms are strange things, and it might have just churned them in and spit them back out, as far north as Ohio and Pennsylvania. The last possibility, which I'm traumatized thinking about it, is that somehow or another they got caught inside the eye wall in the eye of the storm. And if that were the case, they literally had to fly in circles the whole way that storm traveled over those days before they could escape that eye wall. So they may have been, if that was the case, they would have to have been flying in that eye for days, because if they contacted that eye wall, birds are fragile beasts, and they would have just crushed them. And so those are the three possibilities. I think the first one is the most likely to have occurred.
Well, it may be hot in Florida still, but it is September, mid-September. People are wondering what is going to happen to the flamingos that are outside of Florida. What are they going to eat? Where are they going to go? What's going to happen?
Well, they flew here, they can fly back. That's my short answer. But yeah, these flamingos are quite capable of flying over huge distances of open water. The part of this is the American flamingo, and its population is basically the Caribbean Sea and all along its coastal and island habitats. But there's this one population that's out in the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean. So it's literally 1,000 miles away. Those birds got there somehow. And so they are capable of that kind of flight. They're probably just resting. They're traumatized, need some food, tired, need some water, and they'll start moving back south all on their own. Flamingos across the world, there's 6 different species, and there's always these strange sightings of birds way away from where they're supposed to be, and they turn around and come back. So the ones that are up north, once it starts getting a little chilly, these birds will head south, I believe. And hopefully they'll stay in Florida, but I suspect they'll end up going even further south.
So you mentioned that Peaches has a band and has a satellite tracker. People have noticed that Peaches is interested in the band and the tracker. Can you talk about everything that has gone into making sure these devices are safe for birds, and when do you decide to use them on a flamingo, in the past and in the future?
Well, we are hesitant to catch flamingos like Frank did with Conkey. He used a net gun, which is just basically exactly what it says it is. It's a gun that shoots a big net. Those birds were going to be euthanized because they were on a naval base anyway. And so we had to take that risk. We don't want to take that risk with wild animals, with any bird. I capture spoonbills, and I put transmitters on them. And I've done that almost 40 times now. And I've followed those birds for years. Conkey was out there for 2 years, and yes, the bird immediately, as soon as we were done putting those bands on it, it started playing with them. pecking at them, and of course it did. This is a new thing to that bird. It's going to be sensitive to it for a while. It's like, what is this thing around my leg? I remember when, more than when I got married, for example, I never wore rings, and I put on a wedding ring, many, many years ago. I'll save my wife that. But I remember I played with it all the time, and now I don't even think about it. And I've had an earring, and it's the same thing. This is the same thing, is that this is new to the bird. It's going to pay attention to it. It's something, it's going to pay attention to its bling. Hey, I got this new bracelet. It's great. But what we saw at Conkey, what I've seen with spoonbills, is once a couple days go by, it's part of them. Doesn't bother them at all. And specifically, the bird banding lab, this is highly regulated. You can't just go out there and put bands on birds just because you think it would be cool. You have to come up with a proposal, a scientific reason, and you have to be able to publish those results. So it's very regulated. And one of the things that's regulated is the size, is you cannot put any more weight on a bird than 3% of its body mass. So flamingos weigh, 1,500 grams, 2,000 grams, I'm not sure what, but it can't be more than 3% of your weight. And in this case, what we put on it was less than 2% of the bird's weight. So it's not carrying around a lot of weight. That little transmitter is a powerful little thing. It's got a GPS in it. It's got a solar panel. It connects to satellite communication devices, and 4 times a day it gets a location, or 6 times a day. And then every 4 days, it transmits that back to satellites so we can download it. So it's a remarkable piece of equipment. Yes, the birds appeared to be really interested in that. I just want to summarize that they get used to it very quickly, and this is done with the utmost care for the bird. And we don't just go out there to do this for no reason. We have a clear scientific basis for going out there and putting this on this bird, because we want to understand how this bird utilizes the habitat and how we can work towards things like Everglades restoration, and how that'll have a positive effect on the environment for these birds, to benefit these birds.
Great. Thank you so much. So let's say that some of these flamingos are able to stay, especially in Florida. Do you believe the habitat can currently support them? Maybe not only in South Florida, but maybe up in the Panhandle as well, where Pinky is. Do you think if they want to stay, that there's enough habitat and food for them?
I think Florida will welcome them with open arms, habitat wise. We have done a great deal of conservation, not only in the Everglades and restoring the Everglades, but in protecting our habitats, and making state parks and national wildlife refuges. And the tribal lands are very important. And the state of Florida owns a great deal of the Everglades for water conservation areas. So there is a lot of habitat that is only becoming more and more enticing as we learn to treat it better, as we restore and protect the habitat. So yes, I absolutely believe. Somebody asked me what I want Peaches to show us. And I want Peaches to find a mate, and that's someplace in Florida Bay. I would find that very exciting. So yes, I think Florida can absolutely support a nesting population of flamingos.
So if they are staying in Florida, are there predators that are a threat to flamingos? And also pythons. Are pythons something that they consider or worry about?
They're no more threatened by our native species than they would be in Cuba or the Yucatan. I've been in wading bird colonies in the Yucatan and Cuba. And you know, you encounter crocodiles, you encounter other things. The pythons are a curious joker in the deck. We know that pythons in the Everglades have pretty much been documented to have eaten every species of wading bird that we have. But our populations of wading birds continue to increase. When I started working here, you know, there were between 5,000 and 20,000 nesting pairs of wading birds total in all of the Everglades. As we started to restore that habitat, by the 19 teens, we got a jump to 50s, and that became the new norm, somewhere around 30 to 50,000 nesting pairs. Over the last 5 years, we've had 2 years of upwards of 100,000 nesting pairs. And this is why pythons themselves are becoming more and more problematic. And I'm not saying pythons are not a problem, but these birds with their populations are able to apparently withstand that and grow to phenomenal proportions. So yes, I am worried about pythons. I wish we did not have them. I wish we didn't have any of these exotic species. We got tegus now too. But it's something that we have to live with at this point, and I think flamingos can do that.
Great. We are edging on towards 7, so we're just going to do a few more. A few folks have asked if sightings are going to be available on a website. While I don't think there's going to be a live thing where you can follow peaches, hopefully we'll be able to share some updates in the future. So if you have not already signed up for our news alerts, you definitely should, because we will keep you posted as we can. So Jerry, I am one of the lucky people who got to see one of the hurricane flamingos in Port St. Joe. And I also, unfortunately, noticed some people getting too close to the flamingos. So what can we do to give these flamingos the space that they need? And how do we know when we are too close?
You know, you're too close if they're paying attention to you. If they're not doing their normal behavior, if they're looking at you, shuffling their feet, kind of moving away, you're way too close. I have been encouraging, this is a phenomenal sight. Please go out there and enjoy these wonderful birds with such great personalities. But give them their distance. They've been through a traumatic experience. They're probably weak. They're tired. They're going to be tired. And they're trying to figure out where they are on top of that. Imagine your confusion if something picked you up and threw you about 1,000 miles away, and you know, you had to walk the whole way very rapidly. You would be tired too. So yes, go enjoy them. But just because you read on Facebook or wherever that, hey, you can go see this bird here, be polite to the bird, give it its space. I would say probably if you're within 200 feet, you're probably about as close as you want to be. These are big birds. They're used to having a lot of space around them. If you know, other flamingos, they all crowd in there, but you know, human beings are not something that they normally associate with safety. So give them their space, be polite.
Great. So I'm going to ask you one more question, Jerry, and then you get a well-deserved rest. In this photo that we're actually looking at, most people can see that there are pink flamingos and there's kind of a grayish flamingo. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, the ratio of juveniles to adults that you've seen or that you're looking at, or is that an interesting question for you as you delve in?
It is quite interesting, Erica, is that it amazes me how many juveniles, the lighter color ones, especially the ones with the black on them. Now, flamingos will lose their color. And they will turn gray if they don't have the correct diet. It doesn't mean they're sick or anything else. It's just that they take that color from the shrimp and the algae they eat. The algae have what's called a carotenoid, or the crustaceans. It's why when you take raw shrimp and you throw it in a pot of boiling water, it turns pink. There's a lot of coloration in those things. And so what flamingos do is they don't break down that color. They simply collect it and sequester it into their wings. And so if they're not getting that, then they will turn a lighter color and eventually kind of be a grayish white. But this bird that I'm looking at here with kind of the deep black, that's more of a juvenile. You can also see its eyes are black. If you look at the adults, their eyes are yellow. And so that bird is less than a year old. And I was really surprised at how many of these young birds made this trip along with adult birds. I would say it's almost a 50-50 split, which again, could be that, you know, mom and dad are taking them to a new location. You know, kids were going on a road trip and then a hurricane blows up and we end up, you know, in Kentucky. So that happens. But yeah, the coloration is very interesting and it's very, very diverse in flamingos. And I always compare it to the other bird, my beloved spoonbills, which are also just a wonderful bird to see, brilliant pink. But spoonbills are hatched pink, they grow pink, they die pink. And that's because they have a metabolic pathway to make those pigments, whereas flamingos just take it from the animals they eat and sequester it. So that's the difference in their coloration, and that's why you have such variety in flamingo coloration.
Great, which is always fun to see. Well, again, if you want updates on our flamingo research, how you can help flamingos, if you want updates on peaches, make sure you sign up for our news alerts. We've been putting our different social media handles in the chat. You can also follow us on there. As Julie mentioned, you can support Jerry's groundbreaking flamingo work. And Jerry, is there anything you want to leave us with before we end for this evening?
No, just my thought that if you are near the reported flamingo, please go enjoy it, but give it its space. And that's really what I want to close with.
Absolutely. And Julie, any last words before we send us out at exactly 7 o'clock?
Just thank you, everybody, for enjoying the flamingos with us and leaning in and doing what you can to help birds in the places that they need. So have a good evening, all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.